Good afternoon, happy noon, and welcome to Unhoused. We're really pleased for everybody who has joined us for this important conversation today. Really grateful you're here. We have well over 100 people in this conversation, pushing 150. You really joined us for a critical conversation here in our community about people who are experiencing homelessness, about the crisis of the unhoused, and particularly how it impacts children, youth, and families. We have a remarkable group of people to join us today in this conversation, and we're glad that you could share your noon hour with us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and thanking our sponsors for today who've helped underwrite this event. In part that is NetTech, and in part that is Amazon, and we definitely are grateful to both of them for this. And I'd like to say a word about first who I am and why I'm so grateful you're here. I will offer a land and labor acknowledgement here in a moment, and then I'll introduce you to our esteemed panel of guests. My name is Peter Drury. It's my honor to serve in the role of Chief Strategy Officer for Wellspring Family Services. I serve among a remarkable group of peers, one of whom is on this panel today, Asa Tate, in leading and working inside this organization to help end the cycle of family homelessness here in our community. I'd like to begin by honoring and acknowledging land and labor. Would you please pause with me? Even close your eyes, take a deep breath, separate from the hurry and the busyness of it all, and join with me in acknowledging this land, this place where each of us are and dispersed apart in this virtual occasion, this land where we are, which has been stewarded since time immemorial by the first peoples of this continent. And we acknowledge and we are grateful for the Coast Salish people, all the tribes who have cared for thousands and thousands of years for this place that we now get to enjoy. I in particular give gratitude to the Suquamish tribe, for I grew up in that land and live in land that has been stewarded by them. And I would encourage each of you here to reflect on the land where you've both been raised and the land where you are today, and to give thanks. In addition, we acknowledge the vast history of labor, and in particular forced labor, slavery, on the backs of which the economy was built, on which we are attempting to reconcile problems still today. Issues of equity, issues of racism, issues of power, and most certainly issues of homelessness, which are directly tied. So both in terms of our land and in terms of acknowledging both the awful history of forced labor and also the opportunity that future labor offers us to solve this problem and to ask ourselves, can we commit to the labor to solve homelessness? In all these ways, we acknowledge and we give thanks. We have a remarkable group of peers today to share with you. They're far more important than I, so I want to begin to turn the attention to them. I'm going to begin with my esteemed peer and colleague, Michelle Merriweather, who is the CEO of the Urban League. I'd like to ask her to come on camera and introduce herself for a moment.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for the acknowledgement. It's an honor to be with you all today to have this very important discussion. My name is Michelle Merriweather. I have the honor of serving as the CEO of the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle and a partner with many of the folks that will introduce themselves today. And I come to this work out of passion and out of just the understanding that when we work together to solve our community issues, and we come from a place of abundance and rather than deficit, and bring all of our sources and resources together, great things will be accomplished. And I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Michelle. Next, I'm going to ask Kilmendy, who is the Executive Director of Housing Connector, a premier colleague and partner of Wellspring. Skelchum?
Thanks, Peter, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kilmendy. I'm the founder and Executive Director of Housing Connector, a local nonprofit working with property owners and nonprofits to increase access to housing. Beyond that, as you can see behind me, I'm a new dad, and so adjusting to COVID and being a new father. And originally, I'm actually from Kosovo in Eastern Europe and immigrated to the U.S. as a refugee in the late 90s, which really fuels a lot of the work that I do locally, and look forward to sharing more about that here in a moment.
Thank you, Skeltrum. Next, we're honored to have Representative Kirsten Harris-Talley from the Washington State Legislature, representing the district in which Wellspring resides.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's such an honor to be on this panel. I'm Representative Kirsten Harris-Talley, she, her pronouns, and I'm the newest member of our all-woman of color delegation at the state level here at the 37th. And I am so proud to have Wellspring as one of many providers of essential services for our families in need. And for those who we know, most folks just need a little help up. I know I have experienced in my life, my family when I was growing up needed assistance, food assistance. I myself have had those times, like many of us, where you're sitting looking at the bills and knowing you can pay one, but not the other, and figuring that out. And too many of our neighbors were already experiencing that before this pandemic. And I was really proud with so many colleagues to start putting some policies in place at the state level that now I'm seeing organizations like yours, Michelle's, and others putting those dollars to good work and implementation now. So excited for the conversation about how government shows up as a partner with community to make the changes and solutions that community already has. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. We're delighted you're here. Next, I'll introduce David Wertheimer, and given what Representative Harris-Talley just said about public sector as a partner, David Wertheimer has had a unique angle on seeing philanthropy's role in setting up solutions for government to pay attention to. David, welcome, and will you please introduce yourself?
It's an honor to be here. Thank you. And what an amazing group of people to be with today. I'm David Wertheimer, and pronouns are he, him. I came to Seattle in 1990 after running a gay and lesbian nonprofit organization in New York City for a number of years, and worked in county government for 10 years on homelessness and housing and addiction-related issues in the Department of Community Human Services. Ended up my last 13 years at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where I ran the strategy in family homelessness that worked in King, Pierce, Snohomish counties, and then became Director of Community and Civic Engagement. And now I'm the old retired guy working very part-time as an adjunct faculty member at the School of Theology and Ministry at Seattle University. An honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thrilled you could join us. And last but not least, my treasured peer and colleague, Asa Tate, who serves as Chief Development Officer at Wellspring Family Services. Welcome, Asa.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. This is an amazing panel. I have spent my entire career in nonprofits trying to help folks in health and human services. And I continue the legacy of my grandmother and my mother, who wanted to take care of all of their neighbors. If they're not well, I'm not well. And I'm honored to be here at Wellspring. I'm honored to be in partnership and collaboration with each of you and countless others to take care of our community and the families who need us.
Thank you. In a moment, I'm going to call on Asa, on you to start off this conversation, but I'd like to frame it up just a little bit, because this conversation starts with a question that a prospective donor asked Wellspring that I think a lot of people are asking right now. This is someone who's thinking about their priorities and generosity, and they're looking at the homelessness crisis, and they're coming to us saying, you know, I'd really like to help somehow, but I keep seeing this homelessness problem grow more and more and more, and am I just throwing money if I give at something that's not working, or are there actually solutions that work? Now, as vexing of a question as that can be, there actually are solutions, but for the general public, it's hard to know what works and what doesn't work. Why is it that the homelessness crisis visibly seems worse, but does anything work? Can anything, solve the problem? This group of panelists today is each going to give you insight on how we can move from the vexingness of that question to really understanding what solutions can and do work. But let's start by defining family homelessness. How is that different from homelessness generally speaking? Because that's really going to shape this conversation today. So Asa, I'm going to turn to you and ask you, what is family homelessness? What are we even talking about?
Sure, happy to respond. I will admit, before I joined Wellspring Family Services, it was very easy to believe that homelessness was limited to people living in tents, often near the freeway or under a freeway overpass, or in a park. And I quickly learned that this was just a small slice of the pie and only a portion of the reality. What I was seeing and what many of us see on our daily commutes and travels is often referred to as adult chronic homelessness. What I wasn't seeing and what was often hidden and invisible is family homelessness. And at Wellspring, In particular, we've been providing resources and reassurance to families in crisis for 129 years. Yes, I said 129 years, almost as long as Seattle has been a city. And our mission as a result is to end the cycle of family homelessness. So to put it in perspective, I would say that a family struggling with permanent housing will exhaust themselves trying to come up with creative ways to keep their families both safe and together. And that may mean sleeping on the couch of a friend or a family member. It may mean sleeping on the floor. It may mean sleeping in their car. And often this only will last, especially the sleeping at a friend or a family's house, until you wear out your welcome. And then you try to move to the next friendly person that might be able to take you in for a matter of days. But what I think is surprising to a lot of folks who are probably watching today or concerned about the issue is that many of the families that we serve are working. They are working poor. They do not make enough money to make a living wage. A minimum wage and a living wage are two very different things. And as a result, they cannot cover both rent and monthly expenses, as Representative Talley alluded to earlier. Hopefully, we've all seen the studies by now showing that 40% of US households do not have $400 in savings. So imagine you have no savings, but emergencies are still coming your way. And this pandemic is a wonderful example of that. Most emergencies are medical or say a car breaking down. Those are going to cost you upwards of $1,000 to $2,000. And as you can see, that math just does not add up. And so the families we serve are going to have to call on someone for a financial emergency. And typically the people in their network do not have the resources to help them financially. As a result, Wellspring and all of the partners on this call and beyond, our job is to be their safety net. We want to be there to help fill in the blanks, connect the dots, and provide the resources that are missing for our families to remain stable and housed. What I've learned in my time at Wellspring over the years here is that prevention is key. And whenever possible, we turn to prevention first. It is always more cost effective to keep people housed. And it's definitely less traumatic to make people move and uproot their families, their school districts, and beyond. So whenever we can, we want to prevent. And the last thing I'll say about this in my definition of family homelessness is that we're really focused on ending the cycle. We also know that if a child has experienced homeless once in their young lifetime, they're 30% more likely to experience homelessness again. And after that first experience or second, the percentages just continue to increase. So prevention, 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 and I will stop there.
Thank you, Asa. You know, another layer of this to build on what Asa is suggesting is there's incredible inequities in terms of how these numbers and how the data plays out. I'm going to ask Michelle from your angle from the Urban League for a moment, because we know that women and people of color, BIPOC people in particular, are so disproportionately impacted. And you live in the land of and work in the land of and lead in the land of fighting inequity. So can you shed a little more light on this crisis for us from the perspective of equity and inequity?
Absolutely. I will say that all of this certainly stems from racism and systemic inequities that have plagued not only our city, but our county and country for generations. 400 years we've been, my people have been subjected to racist policies, from slavery to Jim Crow to redlining. And now we are living the 21st century version of that, which unfortunately forces many families and people to be unhoused. And it also plays out in inequities that lead to compiling challenges that force people and families to be unhoused, from violence in homes and in communities, to employment challenges, to education inequities. And, you know, if you don't have the means to connect to stable employment to because of something that happened in your past, because of, you know, the zip code that you live in, you know, many issues come together, but it all is based and stems from race. And we have been living this for so many, many years. And then the other challenge is now most of our families are a single mother and two children. And that single mother living on one income, as Asa said, most of them are working, living on one income, trying to provide for her family. And when some emergencies happen, she has to take, or, you know, child gets sick, or other things happen, she has to take time off from work. When she doesn't work, she doesn't earn an income and has to provide for her family. So, you know, many issues stem from race, from equity, and we face it every day. And I think the challenge there is that yes, community certainly has the solution, and we can do the work to get to where we need to go, but it takes all of us working together to solve this crisis. And one, to also recognize that that history and address that history and not ignore it and think that it's just going to go away.
Thank you. I want to build on that a little and turn, David, to you in a moment. I know that after the little over a decade of the Family Homelessness Initiative here in this region, specific to King, Pierce, and Snohomish counties, one of the chief takeaways when I heard the report from the Gates Foundation at a summit this past spring was in and around racial equity as, you know, a primary cause of this crisis. There obviously were additional factors layered upon that, but I want to turn to you first because the Gates Foundation certainly discovered that in their work and came out with that as a leading comment, but also, you know, you have other thoughts about kind of, in addition to that, what builds upon racism to create this family homelessness crisis?
Sure, thank you, Peter. And I want to second what both Michelle and Asa have said about the origins of the crisis of homelessness, and perhaps use, and not inappropriate coming from the Gates Foundation, a medical metaphor to talk about this. And the metaphor is this, that homelessness to me is a symptom, and it's a symptom of diseases. Now, yes, the job of the physician, the first job of the physician is to alleviate the suffering of the symptoms. But if you don't treat the underlying illness, the patient dies. And the underlying illnesses to me are many, but there are three in particular that drive family homelessness. And the first one, which we have talked about, is structural racism, which is, I think, the most critical foundational cause of homelessness in our communities. But also, there are two others that I want to talk about. One, which we have talked about a little bit, Michelle described, is gender inequities. And the fact that 75% of homeless families are headed by single moms. And a single mom working minimum wage in our communities here in Puget Sound, she needs to work 104 hours a week to afford the average two-bedroom apartment for her and her kids. There's no mom, single mom, that can do that, which is why 75% of homeless families are headed by single moms. So gender inequity is a second major cause or disease that we're facing. And then the third, I would say, is the extreme wealth inequities that have been driven historically by race and by gender, by a variety of different factors, where there are insufficient mechanisms to generate the intergenerational wealth that is now required to survive in our communities, where the rents are so high, where housing costs are so extreme. And this really gets to the question of sort of the inputs to family homelessness that we need to address in order to reduce the output or the number of families that fall into homelessness. And until we really understand and accept these underlying diseases that are causing this crisis in our communities, we won't be able to solve this problem. Yes, we have to treat the symptoms and alleviate suffering. And Wellspring is one of the best organizations doing that work for 129 years in our communities. But until we treat those diseases, we will not end this crisis.
Thank you, David. That now makes me want to turn to the logical partnership between kind of philanthropy and our core economy and the whole public policy arena. As I say, we're so honored to have Representative Harris Talley here with us, and I'd love to have you comment. Representative, there's so many things you could say. I know you could probably talk for hours to us, so I'll have to have you choose what you want to say. But the role of public policy for us as citizens, the same thing. When I open this up, talking about a donor asking us, why would I donate? I think voters are asking the same questions, right? Neighbor to neighbor, we're saying, what can we do to solve this? What are you seeing in Olympia? What are you seeing in the neighborhood in Rainier Valley? What are you seeing, and what can you tell us?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I'm seeing in Rainier Valley, I want to say first and foremost, is a huge amount of service facing organizations and mutual aid networks, right? Who are all hands on deck, getting to exactly, I think what you said so eloquently, David, to address the symptoms of these intersectional ills within our society. So I just want to say that off the bat. The 37th has for generations and continues to act, to do, to show up. All of us need to. The core at any question when it comes to equity is about resource. Who is it stolen from? Who is it taken from? And how is it spent collectively? The beauty of the question when it comes to government is that that resource is a public good. We each contribute a little tiny bit through taxes towards a public pool, where then the little bits add up to a lot of dollars that can be invested back into our communities and neighbors. That's when government's really running on all cylinders, what it looks like and why we have taxation. We also live in a state that has the most upside down tax code in the entire country, at a time when we have more accumulated wealth in the world than we have ever have measured. And let me state clearly, in a state with more billionaires and millionaires per capita almost than anywhere on the globe. The largest corporations in the world, the most expensive and money holding folks in the world, they're right here in Washington state. And many of them are sitting on billions and billions of dollars. And when they're asked to give their little bit to match what working families give, they say no. So what does that mean in Washington state? In Washington state, that means that the poorest among us pay almost 17% through the tax structure we have. That's in sales tax. Anytime a homeless person needs to buy toilet paper, they're paying more taxes than a rich person in this state. Let me say that again. Every time a houseless person buys toilet paper, they're paying more taxes than rich people in this state. So when we're talking about the inequities, we have to really sit with that. I also want to go back to how you started, Peter, with the land acknowledgement. I cannot talk about houselessness in Seattle, Washington, and not talk about how government displaced Indigenous people and made them the first houseless people on this land, their land, that they had stewarded for millennia. That very real reality, the term Skid Row comes from right here, y'all. It's where people literally lived in the mud because they were the spaces where lumber was being pushed down hills because they couldn't afford shelter. And they had to be somewhere after dark so that they weren't arrested. These sorts of things matter. The deep history of what it is to have government both be a contributor to the ills and the healing has to be something that we acknowledge. For me, I serve on the finance committee, and we made a huge amount of strides this year to create more equity in our tax code that's made a big difference. We had the largest investment in capital budget. So think building, right? When we talk about the symptom of houselessness, one of the best Band-Aids we can get is literal roofs to put people under that are affordable, accessible, and consistently affordable. Not affordable just when they get there, but stay affordable over time. And I cannot say enough how much more we need to do in policy to make sure families can stay together under those roofs. We still have a lot of barriers to mamas being able to stay with their babies, to their partners being able to be part of those families, for the multi-generational homes that people build to actually be something that can be in affordable housing models as well. And the working families tax credit, I think, is a great example for what Asa and Michelle were talking through. We actually passed that this year and put dollars behind it for the first time. We'd had it legal in Washington state for a decade, but no law is any good if you don't actually put resources behind it. We also changed the structure of that bill to increase the amount of resources that are given to families with children. And let me be clear, this is us giving a little bit of those tax dollars back to our neighbors and you deciding how to spend it. We're not prescriptively saying you have to spend it on rent, you have to spend it on food, you have to spend it on that car repair. We are trusting that neighbors know where to invest that up to $1,200 that may be coming back to their family into what will actually help their family thrive in that moment. That is essential. And particularly now when people are really balancing what may be a hospital bill, a car repair, and the heat bill, right? Those are a lot of things to balance. So I am seeing in real time how at the state level, we're starting to address these deep inequities that government helped create, that we need to be the folks who help repair. And the other pieces I'm seeing is that we're starting to make investments in mental health services and other services. Do not think that putting roofs over people's head is enough. These are intersectional issues. Everyone here has talked about the intersectional things that are weighing on the hearts and minds of our neighbors and our loved ones when they're trying to get on the other side of crisis. And so us having an intersectional approach and making sure that we don't turn to people and say, take care of yourself, and what they need is community care. That we have community saying, yes, we're here when you need that care. And it's not if, but when, y'all. The reason I shared my experience as a child is I know that that could be an experience I could have again as an elder at any point in my life. What was described about $400 away, most people are $250 crisis away from the most unimaginable thing they can imagine, which is not knowing where they're going to sleep every day. $250 could make or break that crisis point for anyone. So we have a lot that we can do. There's a lot of $250 that we can share with neighbors. And it's not anything for me to share what I have to give to others who need it more in that moment. And that's the way society should work.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. So very many rich comments there. Thank you, Representative. I want to just honestly acknowledge, I don't know if others are feeling the way I am. I feel so grateful to have a public servant and elected official who's able to name the ills and the trauma created by government while at the same time participating in the solution. It's deeply moving to me just alone to hear you speak to that. And I wish I didn't have to be grateful for that in public leadership, but I am grateful for that in public leadership. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. To your point of let's think now about the mom with a child or two or three who is looking for solutions, who is needing to find a way to stay housed. Skelchum, Kilmendy, and the Housing Connector have been looking at something and creating something that frankly didn't exist before, which was how to inspire and encourage greater supply of housing, even from within existing housing stock, and to get landlords more ready to rent. Can we move in that direction for a moment? And Skelchum, given the richness of this conversation so far, can you give us a sense of what you're seeing at Housing Connector? It's really, I think it's important for our audience to know.
Absolutely. I mean, what it stems from fundamentally is what Michelle was talking about, is there's a lot of barriers to housing for individuals in our community. And I think, Michelle, you called it out, right? There's a lot of modern day redlining and racism going on. And Peter, one of the things that I was looking at early on was we saw that even when an individual, when a family had the ability to afford rent, something like low credit score, or past eviction, or criminal history often would keep them from having access to that home. Frankly, we don't have a lot of grace when something goes wrong in our community. And oftentimes we let those setbacks define whether somebody should have a home or not. And there's an issue because it's rooted in the financial system, the criminal justice system, which are inherently have significant flaws around equity. And then we're using those determinants to decide who gets housing and it doesn't. And so it just didn't make sense. And so what we decided to do was to say, okay, how do we help that single mom who has a job but has a low credit score, make sure she can find a home for her family? And so what we did, Peter, was we worked with property owners and managers throughout the region to say, okay, why is it that you're not renting to this family? And oftentimes it's a perceived risk that they're they might be a household that might cause more financial concerns or potentially not be able to pay. And I decided to not tackle the perception. I just said, let me just accept that perception as their reality. And frankly, be where David was saying was just try to treat the symptoms. And so what we do is we, in a sense, mitigate their risk by providing them financial incentives. And in exchange, these property owners and managers waive their screening criteria so families in the community can access housing. And then we provide the support for 2 years to make sure that they don't fall back into homelessness. Is this addressing the core of homelessness? No. But is it helping folks get out of homelessness? Yes. And I think that's, even in this conversation, as I was listening, I was sitting here and I was like, gosh, this is such a big problem. But here's the thing that I hope people remember. We are ending homelessness every single day for individuals and for families. Like, people are exiting homelessness. Housing Connector was able to house over 2,100 people over the last 19 months. And those are individuals that are no longer experiencing homelessness. The issue, though, is more people are falling into homelessness. And this is, I think, when we talked about how do we prevent folks from losing their housing, it's so critical. And there's a lot of work with rent relief. There's a lot of work with us stepping in when somebody has one setback, to make sure that one setback isn't the reason somebody's world turns upside down, as the representative mentioned. And so, and I think, Asa, you talked about it, it's also much more efficient from a financial perspective with that early intervention than it is to wait for somebody to be experiencing homelessness for us to be able to provide them resources. So there are solutions. We are ending homelessness every single day. It's just that we also have to be strategic in how we prevent more folks from falling into that situation and reducing the inflow into homelessness. So, but there's positives happening, Peter, and I think that's the thing that sometimes in the narrative of our community we don't hear, and it becomes frankly depressing. But good things are happening, and we need to focus on what's working and do more of it.
Beautifully and powerfully stated, and frankly, that's so much of why we're gathered. I think that to your point, there is so much that can be done and that is working, and it's important for people to realize that there is this overwhelm of the inflow into homelessness for all the reasons that each of you have described in a variety of ways. And I'm seeing some comments in the chat about affordable housing stock, and we haven't even gone there yet. It's a massive issue and very relevant to this conversation. But in a moment, I'm going to ask Saida, who is supporting this from the Wellspring development team, to kind of curate and share some of those questions. But let me just comment first that, when I look at the Urban League, a part of why we invited Michelle to this conversation, and to Housing Connector, to Wellspring Family Services, and I think about so very many peers in this community, too many to even name, I want to say what Representative Harris-Talley said, is that we have people working in services trying to respond to people who right now are scared, saying, I need housing, right? They either need to wind up in a shelter immediately, or they're about to become homeless and they want to stay housed where they are, or they need a connection to a resource. And there is a fabric, there is a network in this community of service-oriented organizations. We're all aware of root causes, but we're busy fighting at the service level. And so that's why we need other organizations fighting in advocacy and other arenas to help get at the root causes. I tell you, for whether it's a donor or whether it's a voter, if anybody ever says to me, should I give to support, or should I vote to support shelter or affordable housing or family services, I'm like, look, we're all in this together. All of them are needed. In the nonprofit sector, we are not competing with each other trying to win at solving homelessness. We are collaborating together so we can win at solving homelessness. And so truly, if there's an organization that has your heart, if there's a policy that has your passion, please push it forward, because we literally are all in this together. I want to ask Saida if you could come on verbally onto our conversation. There have been some great conversations in the chat, and maybe there are specific questions of our panelists.
Sure. Yeah, we've gotten a couple questions from attendees. And the first one was, what are the numbers of families now imminently facing eviction?
Boy, I try to stay attentive to the daily news on that one. I don't know that I have good data top of mind, literally. Does somebody have a good number top of mind at the moment? I mean, for example, I was just reading data in Pierce County being the worst of all the counties in the state. And I read some number like 27,000 people. So I'm not pausing because I don't know the information, but I take Pierce and King and Sonoma, much less statewide. We're talking about very, very, very large numbers, and I just don't have them top of mind.
I don't know that we know exactly how many are facing it. I know about 18,000 families applied, and the number is growing. And again, I would imagine you can probably double that for the number of people that are potentially facing eviction and have not applied for support.
And Michelle, you're referring to applying in King County, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
I would say in relation to this, right, I think another context for Washington State is, on average, the renter debt that folks are sort of facing down with the pandemic. And of course, the pandemic, I think, right, this last year and a half, all last year, I was like, the way 2020 tells us there's clear vision, we're getting very clear vision on every fault line in every system with this pandemic, right? The healthcare system that intersects with the housing system, that intersects with the educational school, right? Like none of our families housed or struggling with housing are immune from all these institutions and the gaps that have been brought forward. For most folks in the country, the average debt burden right now is about $2,700 because of how extraordinarily expensive it is where we all live to rent. It's closer to $4,500 to $5,000 of debt at minimum for anyone facing renting debt. We are now, of course, on the cusp of the moratorium ending in Washington state. A lot of us are facing down September 30th. I have the pleasure of vice chairing the Black Members Caucus along with Chair Representative Jamila Taylor, who represents out of the 30th district. And we have proactively written a number of letters to the governor with concerns. Quite frankly, right now, what's going to keep most folks out of eviction with this moratorium moment is knowing that they have systems and services available at the county and state level. I also want to note that the array of landlords in our district in the 37th is a complex array. You're not just talking about large development landlords. You're talking about a lot of aunties that rental payment will make or break their ability to age in place. The complexity of these issues and what it looks like to think about what does Douglas houselessness look like if a family isn't able to pay off that debt and then that elder is not able to pay for that mortgage, we could see some very deep hits. So I want to name that for every service industry on the front line, whatever part of this problem you think your action and dollars and way of engaging and activism is going to make a difference, now's the time, you all. Because I do not anticipate this fall is going to be very pretty for this landscape at all. I think every gap that there is, we're going to see too many loved ones and neighbors fall through. And so we all need to be all hands on deck in this particular moment.
Absolutely. I do see Melanie Smith, who represents Wellspring in Olympia, in advancing our legislative agenda, has weighed in with a very helpful comment. Thank you, Melanie, with a link in the chat. According to the Washington State Wire, around 25% of all renters are currently facing evictions. I mean, just, if nothing else, just take that in for a moment. I mean, that stat kind of says it all. I'm also seeing a question in the chat right above that from Jen Gladish. It says, for members of the community that want to affect change in the most impactful way, I love this question, what would you suggest they do outside of legislative encouragement and support? So assuming first and foremost that they're in touch with Representative Harris Talley and with all of your elected officials, all over, whether it's city, county, state levels, federal level. Beyond that, let's talk about how, to the individual citizen, how do they get involved? How do they advance solutions? Asa, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I do. And as a fundraiser, I'm going to go to philanthropy. I think we all have the opportunity to help one another. And I think we all have an opportunity to really commit to and increase our level of trust for the nonprofits and our partners doing this work. It struck me earlier as we were chatting about, who's homeless and keeping people housed. Some of the most heart-touching stories, sad stories that I've heard in this work are the families who are on the cusp and who are being told that in order to receive services, they may have to sleep outside for 2 days to meet the requirements of a contract of who we can serve. And so for me, that comes back to trusting nonprofits and helping to provide flexible funding. The one thing I know to be true for sure is that there's no contract I've ever seen that can anticipate every single one of life's needs. And so for us to be the best partners with our families, we need to be able to meet them where they're at and provide the supports they need in the moments that they're juggling and the realities that they're dealing with. I even wanted to touch on the last question about, who is facing eviction prevention. And I think to Michelle and Skelchum and others' comments earlier, this population and these numbers are fluid. As many people as we're getting housed, there are new people coming in the door. And the pandemic has been the most obvious example of the uncertainty that people are experiencing. And I just want you all to sit and imagine what it must be like to be facing an eviction and to know that all these many months, year and a half, whatever it might be of back rent that I owe has not disappeared. It's still waiting there for this timeline to hit. And so philanthropy can be part of that answer, and trusted partnerships are more important now than ever.
And to add on to that point, Asa and Representative, I'm going to ask you to comment on this in just a second, so I'll just give you a fair warning. Wellspring's put a lot of time in the last couple of years working on just the very definition of homelessness itself. And, we enter a conversation about being unhoused or being homeless, and language really matters. Language really, really matters in all the issues we're discussing. But specific to the word homelessness, if you think about it, to Asa's point, if different organizations, whether it's county government, state government, whether it's private philanthropy, or whether it's individual citizens, if we define homelessness differently, and then someone gives money saying, oh, this is for homelessness, but I define it this way, and someone else says, this is for homelessness, I define it that way, then the nonprofit service organization, not just us, all of our peer organizations, we get stuck in this bind, as Asa describes, where we say, oh, gosh, I'd like to help you, but unless you're out living under a bridge for 48 hours, I can't help. You have to go do that first, And so there's been a move in the state of Washington, which we're really pleased passed this past year, on changing the definition of homelessness, because as a very simple illustration, our public schools have a way that they define homelessness so that they can respond to children and students in school. So if a teacher, if a counselor, if a principal thinks that they're at risk of homelessness, they can get them the resources they need. It's a brilliant definition. It works perfectly well. I won't recite it for you now, but it's a good definition. Well, the minute the public schools refers someone for services at county government or state government, there's somebody saying, oh, sorry, the contract doesn't cover that because we define homelessness differently. So Representative Harris-Talley was a huge supporter of something that was really important this last year, to change the definition. Representative, could you say a word about that?
Yes, I was really honored. We do committee work, and I also serve on the Children, Youth, and Families Committee, and that was the committee that heard this bill. And also a freshman this year, Representative Alicia Rule, was the sponsor of the bill. I think did an incredible job. She herself comes from the service side of work as a social worker herself, and knows too well exactly what you're talking about, Peter. And the beauty of the definition under education is that it talks about that the housing needs to be consistent and consistently adequate. Those terms open up the possibility of so much of what everyone said here. The best way to fight houselessness is to keep someone from ever experiencing it in the first place. And for a baby and a mama and a third grader who's thinking about whether or not they're going to like doing their math test or not, the last thing they should have to worry about is this the month that it's all going to fall out from under me? Am I going to have to jump through hoops? And so that reconciliation of that definition really opens up what's possible for us to proactively provide services when folks are on the cusp of that moment, where if they are already housed or know that they can have that consistency, that we can actually wrap the resources around them to keep that consistency through a crisis point. That's a game changer. It's exactly the direction we need to be in. Prevention is the least expensive solution for government, philanthropy, and our neighbors, hearts, minds, and pocketbooks.
Thank you. And I'm encouraged to know that in the United States Senate this past spring, around the time it passed in Washington State, there's an initiative in the Congress for this to roll out federally. So I think Wellspring and other partners are going to be looking at how to contribute to that conversation as well. So thank you. And thank you for your leadership. And yes, Alicia Rule was a remarkable sponsor of that and a great person to. Hey, on this question of what citizens can do to do more, I know more of you have answers to this. David Wertheimer, I bet you have a thought. Skeltrum, Asa, Michelle, feel free to jump in. But David?
Sure. Yeah. No, I really like the question that Jen Gladish asked, and I think that what we all need to do is to tell government and the funders of services for people experiencing houselessness and homelessness to do what we know works. And one of the things that we were able to do at the Gates Foundation, which philanthropy can do because government has to be investing in what they know works as opposed to experimenting and trying new things that are risky. Philanthropic sector dollars can be used to try new things out, to test approaches. And one of the things we learned at the Gates Foundation that works just about better than anything else to help families not fall into homelessness is access to flexible emergency funding that they can use the way they define they need to use those funds. It's one of the most powerful tools that you can provide to a family to prevent them from becoming houseless. So once we've tested that, it now is obvious, to me at least, that government should be taking that approach to scale. Philanthropy can never scale responses to any of the global problems that we're facing. And yet government has the potential to help do that. So what would happen if government actually said, wow, this flexible funding for families to use as they see fit to prevent themselves from entering into homelessness becomes something that's available at scale to families in Washington state. Small amounts of money, remarkably small amounts of money, can prevent a family from losing their housing. How do we then, so I think it's beholden on all of us to advocate as Representative Harris Talley is doing from her position within the legislature, to say, how do we take these approaches to scale and make them work for more and more families?
Beautiful, beautiful. Who else? It's threatening to say who else wants to follow that, because that was brilliantly stated, but I know others want to expand on this conversation. Skelchum, what do you think folks can do to step up?
I think that's a hard question, and I don't want to pretend like I have a good answer there. And I'll defer to others who are way more informed than I am. But here's what I'll say, building off of what David said. I think about that we as an entire industry, as a sector, need to be a little better at taking risks, and funders, whether it's government, philanthropy, needs to accept risk. And I had a conversation today with someone, and they were like, well, how do you take risks? And I was like, and why do you take risks as an organization? And my thought is because the status quo is unacceptable. And we can't just expect to do the status quo and change and get better results. So we have to be willing to take some risks, take some chances in order to try to address this issue in a different way. And I think philanthropy can be really good at that, and investing in things that have potential but maybe don't have progress or don't have proven results. But I think government needs to get in that same arena as well. And I think about, the R&D space. If we think about, like, for example, the investment that government makes in space and in other areas, and that investment then allowed others to take that research and do more and build off of it. And I would love to see if our government was willing to do something more of that. When we have an idea, for there to be that unrestricted funding or support to say, try it out. But you know what, try it out, but we're going to hold you accountable to the results. And if it works, we'll invest to scale it. And I think about that from our organization. We were fortunate at Housing Connector to have the city of Seattle and King County say, this is an interesting idea. And in fact, I actually had people at the city and the county tell me this had no chance of working, our model. But they said, here's some funding for you to try it. And they took a chance. We tried it. We implemented it. We showed results. And actually, Peter, what it's done now is it's attracted private dollars to help support Housing Connector. So I love what David talked about, but Housing Connector is an interesting case study in the reverse, where government stepped first and then philanthropy followed. And again, it doesn't matter who steps first, but I think having that space to take risks is really critical for us to move forward and not settle for the status quo.
These points are really well taken, especially around risk. Each of us, just in our own lives, when you make a decision, should I take this job or not? Should I go to school or not? Should I move across town or not? Should I do something we always have a personal risk calculus about, like, well, is it worth it to me to do this? Is it not? We ask it, but you get into the public sphere and in the collective, how do we ask our questions, about what we take risks for? And when we get to crises of these proportions, we've got to take some risks. We absolutely have to. So I'm really grateful to each panelist speaking that. Michelle, you see a lot. The Urban League and Wellspring work really closely together in eviction prevention in particular. You hear a lot of stories. You see a lot of this. What gives you hope in encouraging someone in response to this crisis how to step in?
Absolutely. I appreciate the question first and foremost, because that means that somebody cares, right? They're willing to do something to help. And I think, one, it matters who represents us in Olympia, in the mayor's office, in city council. So one, get involved, vote, number one, because we need more Representative Kirsten Harris Talleys in Olympia advocating for the least of us among us. Two, I will always say one of the simplest things you can do If you want to show somebody you care, it's to show them you care. Don't ignore the person or family that is struggling through crisis, because many, and don't pretend like you don't see them. Acknowledge them, give them a smile, ask them how their day is. That's really simple, and it doesn't cost you anything. If you have money to give, invest in organizations and people that are doing great work. It's not a risk. We've been doing this work for a long time. We know what works. We need the investment, and anything helps. $1, $5, whatever, anything helps to help us move the needle and support families. And then I would say the difference oftentimes for a family between sleeping in a bed and a safe roof over their head and feed their families is about $1,000, $1,200, I think, is our average check, right? Which in the grand scheme of things is not a whole lot, right? And it goes back to David's point, that flexible funding. Just imagine if we were not necessarily, we as service providers, were not necessarily beholden to the rules of those that give us the funding to support the work, right? If we can just, a family comes to us and says, we need XYZ, without question, we support them. And then we have ongoing support. So yes, we get them housed, and we get a roof over their head. What's it gonna take to keep them there, right? And keep them housing. And for us, a lot of that work, and I'm sure that my Wellspring family partners can agree that a lot of that work isn't funded. It's just the work that needs to be done, right? To make sure that that families are successful, helping them get a job. Yes, we got them a roof, right? That's what the funder said do. I won't mention any names. We checked that box. We got them a roof over their head. But is that sustainable? If we don't help them get a job, figure out where they are, help them address the trauma and drama and mental anguish that got them in the position in the first place, we're going to see them again in 3 months, 6 months, a year from now. But so if we can, work with families to provide the access to the tools that they need long-term, we can address this. And I think that it takes all of us to do that work, to lean in, to do their small part, our small part, to make that happen. And that can happen in if you're tuning in today, in any way possible, from voting to advocating to donating to volunteering your time. There is a way and a space for you to be a part of this solution.
Outstanding. As we prepare, oh yes.
I just want to add on to that, because Michelle is right on. To me, it's all about dignity. I talked about the philanthropy trusting us, but we also have to trust the people we serve. And who better to know what is needed than those in that position? These people, these neighbors. This is somebody's daughter, somebody's son, somebody's brother. They are no different than you and I. And it makes me think of one of my early jobs in nonprofit at Food Lifeline. And one of the most pivotal turning points is when food banking went from prescribing what was in your bag of food to letting you shop and pick out what you need. Yeah. The same is true in our family store. But we don't have everything, as Michelle said. We don't have all the pieces, but we can definitely connect them to our partners and our peers to try to make sure that people have the tools to remain stable for the long term. One of those things that comes to mind that I know we do often is landlord tenant training. So you have a place now, but how are you going to interact with your landlord so you can avoid an eviction down the road, right? So it's a big puzzle, and we're trying to put all the pieces together, and no one of us has every puzzle piece. And the community is a key part of that puzzle.
Exactly, community, and just being a part of the community. If you want to support, just be a part of community and invite those folks to be a part of the community. They're not the others, they're not the outside. They're a part of our family, our friends, neighbors, and community. Absolutely.
As we begin to move toward a close, I want to remind our audience that this very group of panelists has agreed to come back in 2 months in November. And we're going to extend this conversation. So today was part one of a 2-part conversation, Unhoused. We wanted to open up the issues. We wanted to look at, to what David said about looking to root causes rather than symptoms. We wanted to get into how we describe those symptoms. We didn't want to leave you on a depressed note, so we wanted to kind of imply some of the solutions. We want you to know there is hope. And I'll tell you, by reading the chat, I just want to give some shout outs to Amanda and to Shannon and to Hong and other, lots of great stuff coming up in the chat. I want you to know that we're going to save that, and it's going to help inform our next conversations as well. So we're not ignoring that. I recognize some of the names in the chat from colleagues from other agencies in town, and we're just so glad that you're involved. A number of peers are here on this call. But please know that there's time in the next about 6 weeks. You can contact us. You can let us know if you have ways you want to deepen this conversation when we all come back. I'll tell you that date and time in a moment. I believe it's November 14th at noon, but I better check my notes before I say that out loud. But I just want to honor this conversation. This has been remarkable today. I mean, really, it's just, I know the audience is just thrilled to hear you all commenting. I did see a question from Hong that I thought might be a nice one for us to start to wrap this on. It related to the intersection between homelessness and education. It's a complex issue. We can't open it all up in about 3 minutes, but I will say that there's quickly, people should know that the Homeless Student Stability program, which is run within, if you take the Department of Commerce in the state of Washington and you dive down to the Office of Youth Homelessness, there is a program that's been dedicated called HSSP, the Homeless Student Stability Program, really focused on this issue of the intersection of education, public schools, and student homelessness. There are a ton of resources there, and one of our trusted partners from Wellspring is Building Changes. Building Changes is an organization who helps as a conduit in managing all of that. And I can put a link in the chat in a moment, but they have a link to an incredible database about, in every single school district all over the state of Washington, what that homelessness data is. This is, and it goes back to why I mentioned the definition of homelessness earlier, because if every public school knows who they're identifying every school year, who's at risk of homelessness, that's an incredible data set for people all over the state of Washington and frankly all over the nation to be responding to. So I do want to say to you quickly, on that point, that Wellspring has a contract that I'd love to see all over the state. It's the only one I know of. The Tacoma Public Schools and Tacoma Housing Authority went together, and then they mediated through the Pierce County Human Services, and they hired Wellspring to be a single point of contact for the Tacoma Public Schools. So if a teacher or a counselor or a principal is concerned about a student, they're identified under what's called the McKinney-Vento Act. They're identified being at risk of homelessness, that they have a trusted nonprofit partner who works with that district to get help for that family. There's only one in one district in the state that I know of. We're really honored and thrilled to be a part of it. We would love to scale that work much farther. I know, David, you're on the board of directors for Building Changes. I don't want to put you on the spot on a student homelessness question, but I bet you probably have something you could say about that. Is that right? Or am I going to put you on the spot?
No, absolutely. And I think this is a really important intersection. And the more that we can work with the homeless school coordinators in our schools and with the school districts, just to cite one piece of data that is really relevant here. There's something called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, that are a set of traumas that a child can experience. And those are related sometimes to family, sometimes to school, sometimes to community. Adverse childhood experiences correlate remarkably directly to adult experiences of homelessness. The research has proven that adverse childhood experiences correlate to adult homelessness. So the more we can address reducing those traumatic experiences for children when they're young, at home, in school, keeping them stable in their school environment, keeping them stable in their homes, the more we can reduce those adverse childhood experiences that lead to adult episodes of homelessness. So we're clearly in a multi-generational process of trying to interrupt the cycles of trauma and abuse and neglect and inequity that cause homelessness across multiple generations. It's critically important work.
Sorry, I had to find my mute button there. I got a correction, so please hear this clearly from me. November 18th at noon. November 18th at noon is part 2. This very panel is going to reconnect, and we're going to build on this conversation around solutions. I'm definitely seeing some questions in the chat about can links be saved and circulated, and yes, indeed, we're going to do that. We're going to save the chat. We'll put some resources together in our follow-up email. For those of you who registered, we'll make sure you see some of those. And thank you, David, for those comments on the spot. I really appreciate that. Well, we're wrapping up on the hour. I want to respect everybody's time, and I'm going to ask in just a moment. I know, we're on a webinar, so you all can't wave your hands and shout, but at home you can wave your hands and shout. I just want to give it up for our guests today who've done a remarkable job, had a deep conversation. It's been very, very excellent. To Representative Kirsten Harris-Talley, to Michelle Merriweather at the Urban League, Skelchum Kilmendy at Housing Connector, David Wertheimer, a retired activist, and Asa Tate at Wellspring Family Services. Just in your own home, can you shout and wave and join me in this and say thank you? We're really grateful to all of you. You can toss a note in the chat to say thank you to our panelists. A few of us will probably stick around if we have just a minute. Otherwise, people are going to log off and say farewell, and we invite you to be in touch with us. I thank again Amazon and NetTech for helping support this today. Appreciate that. But far more so, I appreciate you all who've attended today, participated in the conversation. You've listened, you've spoken. Thank you for being engaged. Get out there and help solve this family homelessness crisis. We need each other. Okay, thanks very much. Have a good one.